There was no real end of war after Japan's invasion of Manchuria. Japanese armies continued to operate, expanding Japan's control of northern China by 1937. In 1937, a larger war erupted with millions of troops and millions of deaths, primarily civilians. Japan formed the China Garrison Army to operate outside the borders of Manchuria. This army first occupied the eastern half of the Chera province by mid-1935. The China Garrison Army was then moved south into the neutral zone formed by the Tangu Truce. When the two Chinese newspaper owners were assassinated for being pro-Japanese, the China Garrison Army demanded that China withdraw from Hebei province or face an invasion. The Umezu-He Agreement of June 10, 1935, made this official and created a large demilitarized zone throughout much of northern China. A puppet government called the First Hebei Autonomous Council was formed to rule this region for Japan. On the 27th of June, 1935, an agreement was reached. China agreed to remove all troops from the Manchukuo border again and from all of the Chera province. China's military agreed because it remained more interested in fighting and destroying the CCP or Communist Party in China than in resisting Japan for the time being. The China Garrison Army copied the Kuomintang Army's policy of creating a puppet state. In 1935, a descendant of Genghis Khan became the head of the government of Inner Mongolia. Fighting soon erupted between pro-China and pro-Japan factions. In 1936, the new Mongol-led state was named Mingjiang, or Mongoland. By 1936, much of northern China was under Japan's control, either directly by its army or through its carefully managed puppet states. China attempted to rule the demilitarized area through local councils, but this was ineffective. Japan could move troops through the region as it desired. By the end of 1936, Chiang Kai-shek's policy of opposing the CCP or Communist Party rather than Japan was highly unpopular. Chiang held a meeting with his generals in December of 1936. Alarmed at Chiang's obsession with communism, one of his generals, the former warlord of Manchuria, who now operated with the nationalists, arrested Chiang. He forced Chiang to negotiate with the CCP to create a united anti-Japanese front. Chiang agreed after 2 weeks of pressure. This move proved very popular throughout China, and Japan understood that it might now face organized opposition to its conquest. The new alliance between the nationalists and the communists was known as the Second United Front, with the first being the earlier alliance at the start of the Northern Expedition in the 1920s. Both the nationalist and the communist forces fought together as the National Revolutionary Army. In July 1937, Chinese and Japanese troops fought briefly at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, the former Qing dynasty capital of China. Japan's government demanded an apology from China, and Chiang Kai-shek's government refused. By the end of July, both Japan and China had sent large armies into northern China, and fighting began. Beijing and most areas in northern China were rapidly occupied by Japanese armies. Unable to effect the war in the north, Chiang looked for victory elsewhere, responding on the 13th of August by having bomber aircraft attack an area of Shanghai that was controlled by Japan. Japan and China were now at war. On the 15th of August, Japan formed the Shanghai Expeditionary Army with the intention of capturing China's largest city and economic center, Shanghai. Shanghai had areas in it called international settlements. These were areas of Shanghai controlled by foreign governments where foreign-owned factories and other enterprises were located and where many non-Chinese lived. So while Chinese troops attacked Japanese military installations in the international settlement, Japan used bomber aircraft against Nanjing, China's capital, nearly 250 miles from Shanghai. Other cities were also attacked by air as the Shanghai Expeditionary Army began arriving by ship on the 23rd of August. Meanwhile, Japanese armies moved from the north towards large cities further south, using China's own railways to travel rapidly and keep supplied. Hundreds of thousands of troops from both China and Japan battled in and around Shanghai for several months. Chinese troops were not as well equipped or trained as those of Japan, but they fought aggressively. Nevertheless, Japan prevailed, using its superior air and naval forces along with its army. By the end of October 1937, Chinese forces were ordered to evacuate, thus giving Japan control of the mostly destroyed city. Chiang redeployed his troops to protect the route to Nanjing. Japan organized the Central China Area Army in November to move against Nanjing. Japanese forces quickly overwhelmed the Chinese troops sent to block their approach. On the 16th of November, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the government to relocate the city to Wuhan, over 300 miles west of Nanjing. By early December, Chiang had left Nanjing and a small army remained to defend the capital. The city was under siege by the 9th of December and captured on the 13th of December. Japan's Emperor Hirohito appointed Prince Asaka, his uncle, as head of the Central China Area Army just before the capture of Nanjing. Asaka was an ultranationalist and ordered that any Chinese captured be executed. As the Japanese army moved from Shanghai to Nanjing, troops executed captured Chinese soldiers, looted property of Chinese civilians, and raped women and children. Once Nanjing was captured, these crimes multiplied. Tens of thousands of women and children were raped and usually murdered through mutilation afterwards. Probably hundreds of thousands of captured soldiers and civilians were killed. Many victims were tortured to death, but also burned, decapitated with swords, mutilated and used for bayonet practice. Japanese newspapers reported contests to determine which Japanese soldiers could kill 100 captives with a sword first. Historians continue to debate the numbers of people killed during the Nanjing massacre, but 300,000 is one possible figure. Many formerly indifferent foreigners were outraged at actions by Japanese soldiers, helping turn world public opinion against them. This is a quote from historian Jonathan Spence in his book, The Search for Modern China. So he's one of the foremost historians on any topic in modern China. He wrote many, many books. And what he said was this: there followed in Nanjing a period of terror and destruction that must rank among the worst in the history of modern warfare. For almost 7 weeks, the Japanese troops, who first entered the city on December 13th, unleashed on the defeated Chinese troops and the helpless Chinese civilian population a storm of violence and cruelty that has few parallels. The female rape victims, many of whom died after repeated assaults, were estimated by foreign observers at 30,000. The fugitive soldiers killed were estimated at 30,000, murdered citizens at 12,000. Robbery, wanton destruction, and arson left the city in ruins. Japan continued its conquest of China after the fall of Nanjing. Armies invaded southern and central areas of China. The main aim was to take control of railways, cities, and ports. It was hoped that by severing supply lines, China's armies would collapse and Japan would achieve complete victory. In October 1938, the temporary capital of Wuhan was captured, and most ports and railways along the coast came under Japan's control. By mid-1939, Japan had conquered most of eastern China, where the bulk of its population and industries were located. Yet a final victory was still elusive. China's military was increasingly supplied by the Soviet Union, and China changed its military strategies to fight superior Japanese armies. China's government established itself at Chongqing in the far west. Japan attempted to bomb the new capital into submission by aircraft, but this failed. Instead, Japan decided to concentrate on cutting supply lines to Chongqing, leading to conflicts with the U.S. by 1940. Japan was not prepared for a long-term war. The First Sino Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, actions in the First World War, and the invasion of Manchuria were wars that were largely over in a few months, if not weeks. While Japan had certainly expanded rapidly against China from 1931 to 1937, this was accomplished mostly through threats and limited military action. Entering the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese military initially believed that the war would be largely over within 3 months. Many leading generals and admirals believed that the war with China was too great a drain on resources, and that meant that anti-Soviet defenses were being critically weakened. To them, the Soviet Union was the greater threat as it bordered the industrial powerhouse of Manchukuo. Others believed that the Soviet Union was not that great of a threat, and that subjugation of China should be Japan's focus. Millions of Japanese troops were deployed to China, absorbing many of those unemployed during the Great Depression. The military's war needs began to dictate economic and domestic policies. Mass employment and shortage of consumer goods led to inflation, and this led to the government instituting price controls. By the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan's military controlled the government, and soon political parties would be banned. Global responses to Japan's invasion of China were limited in many ways. Most countries had no intention of becoming involved in a war in China. Their primary concern was economic, and this was directly related to their regional colonies. The League was consumed with European affairs in the late 1930s and also fully cognizant of how there was little they could do in regard to Japan or even China. This was also helped by anti-communist leanings in all member states except the Soviet Union, which had joined the League of Nations in 1934. The governments of the League nations may have disliked Japan's actions, but they were fully aware of Japan's anti-communist stance and hoped that Japan would pressure the Soviet Union in Asia. The Soviets may have appreciated Japan being mired in China, as it would reduce pressure against their border. Most League nations also saw China as a large, chaotic, corrupt nation that had only a nominal control of its territory. It was not a nation any other country would be willing to fight another to maintain. China did appeal to the League on the 13th of September 1937. The League referred the matter to the states that had signed the Nine-Power Treaty in Washington in 1922, since that treaty covered Pacific Ocean security matters. The Nine-Power Treaty Conference met in Belgium in November and released a declaration that Japan and China should suspend hostilities and work with other countries to resolve the situation. Of course, they did not. The League simply remained uninvolved, uninterested, and severely weakened as a result of the Abyssinian crisis. The Soviet Union was largely pleased by Japan's invasion of China. Japan's pre-war pressure on Chiang Kai-shek's government ended Chiang's persecution of the CCP in late 1936. This opened the way for the Soviet Union to supply China's now unified government with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and artillery. By late 1938, these allowed China to fight more effectively against Japanese armies. The Soviets were relieved that Japan's soldiers and industries were spending their energy and wealth against China. This essentially meant that they had little fear of a Japanese attack on their extremely long border with Manchukuo. The Soviets also took advantage of Japan's involvement in China, which also helped serve Chiang's forces. In mid-1938, Japanese forces moved rapidly to capture Wuhan, China's temporary capital after the fall of Nanjing. The Soviets caused Japan to temporarily suspend its attack on Wuhan by provoking a conflict at Lake Khasan on the Soviet Union's border with Manchukuo. Fewer than 1,000 soldiers were killed in total, but the Soviets clearly won, deploying at least 22,000 troops against less than 10,000 for Japan. Japan agreed to give the territory to the Soviet Union and to resume the attack on Wuhan. While Japan was able to capture Wuhan, the delay created by the conflict at Lake Khasan allowed the Soviets to ship large quantities of weapons to China's armies. These weapons allowed China's army to slow the Japanese invasion, allowing an orderly evacuation of civilians, faculty, and factories, and the army itself. In May 1939, as Japan began moving west and deeper into China, the Soviet Union again moved to distract Japan and to enrich itself in the process. In May 1939, Soviet and Japanese forces battled at Nomonhan, Mongolia. Mongolia was a puppet state managed by the Soviet Union and allowed the Soviets to deploy their troops along their border with Japanese-controlled China. In September, 20,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, largely by Soviet tank forces, causing Japan to offer the Soviets a section of Chinese territory in return for ending the fight. The Soviets accepted. The Soviet Union would continue to supply China's government with weapons, even when Chiang turned against the Communist Party in China while still in midst of war with Japan. Over $173 million were loaned to China's government, and large quantities of military supplies were provided until Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. At that point, shipments essentially ended as the Soviet Union fought for its very existence. The primary policy of the USA was to preserve its open door policy in the region, which would allow it to continue to sell its products in China. The US government wanted to demonstrate its displeasure with Japanese aggression, but not to the point where Japan would prevent US exports from reaching Asian markets. The USA also did not want Japan to move against its major regional colony, the Philippines. To this end, the US government's initial response was to prohibit the shipment of weapons or war supplies to either China or Japan in September 1937. Since Japan produced most of its own weapons, this only hurt China, the state that the US wished to indirectly support. The USA was the world's largest producer of oil at the time, and Japan relied on US oil imports to fuel its ships and industries. Oil and metals, both essential for Japan's war effort, were not prohibited and continued to be exported from the US until sanctions were imposed in 1940. A small US Navy ship was sunk by Japanese aircraft in December 1937 as Japan moved against Nanjing. This issue was quickly resolved when Japan stated that it was an accident and paid the USA for damages. Reports regarding the Nanjing massacre widely circulated in the US and around the world, perhaps helping the US government become slightly more involved in the conflict. In February 1938, the US lent China $25 million and then remained relatively uninvolved in the conflict until 1940, when Japan began to move against territories outside of China. Germany was in an awkward position with regard to the Second Sino Japanese War. Germany supported Chiang Kai-shek's government because it was anti-communist. It also supplied China with many military advisors and did a great deal of business with China. By 1936, Germany supplied 80% of all weapons used by China's army, and China supplied Germany with tungsten, a crucial metal used to make tools and weapons. Although China benefited from Germany's support, it may be that Germany was more dependent on China's tungsten supplies for its growing military expansion. In 1936, Japan and Germany agreed to oppose communism in the Anti-Comintern Pact. Germany hoped that this would mean increased pressure on the Soviet Union. Instead, Japan concentrated on expanding into China. With the outbreak of war in August 1937, the Soviets faced little pressure on their borders with Korea and Manchukuo. Attempting to be friendly to both Japan and China, both of which it needed, Germany continued to supply China with about 60% of its weapons until late 1938. Only then did Germany, under strong Japanese insistence, end military exports to China. Germany contributed to Japan's overall policies in significant ways, primarily in its dealings with the Soviet Union. Japan's government was completely surprised that Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to the so-called Nazi-Soviet Pact in August 1939. Germany had made clear anti-communist and anti-Soviet statements and policies since 1933, with the rise of the Nazi Party. The new non-aggression pact promised that neither Germany nor the Soviet Union would interfere with the plans and policies of the other. Yet Germany also agreed to supply the Soviets with weapons, The Soviets also agreed to provide Germany with raw materials and other products. This clearly violated the pact and greatly alarmed Japan. Japan desired an aggressive anti-Soviet government near the Soviet Union and Europe so that the Soviets would be less likely to attack Japanese-held territories in the East. As a result of Germany's agreement with the Soviet Union, the Japanese government collapsed and was replaced by one that worked to build better relations with the Soviets and strengthen its relationship with Germany and Italy. In September 1940, the Triple Pact created a formal alliance among Germany, Italy, and Japan. Germany's conquering of France and the Netherlands by mid-1940 created opportunities to expand into French Indochina, which it promptly did. In April 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed a neutrality agreement promising that neither would engage in war on the other. This helped contribute to Japan's policy of expanding its empire into French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, and moving against the USA. It did not have to fear a Soviet attack. Chiang's nationalist government adopted a new strategy after Wuhan was captured, and the government had moved to Chongqing in the far west. This was to simply keep Japanese forces tied down as much as possible so that they committed more and more of their scarce resources to the war. It was hoped that eventually Japan would simply leave, being totally exhausted and unable to achieve an overall victory. Guerrilla fighters were a key part of this strategy, with up to 1 million operating in Japanese-controlled territory. These fighters assassinated Japanese officers, destroyed railroad tracks, sabotaged factories, killed Chinese collaborators, and detonated bombs in buildings occupied by Japanese people. While the guerrilla war continued, along with occasional regular army battles, Chiang Kai-shek worked to consolidate his power. He executed former warlords who had previously had some independence and named himself presidents of various clubs and organizations based in Chongqing. While millions of Chinese had been made refugees and millions of others killed as a result of war, Chiang remained in Chongqing and made little effort to alleviate their suffering or assist in any way. Chiang and his government were widely known as corrupt. Officials demanded payments in order to even cooperate with the military. International financial aid in China often never made it to the military, but instead was given by Chiang to his supporters. The CCP, or Communist Party, used his complacency and corruption to depict the nationalists as not particularly interested in China's people or in their security and wealth. Some decisions by China's armies also caused a loss of support. In an effort to end a June 1938 advance by Japan's armies, Chiang ordered the destruction of dikes that kept the Yellow River from flooding a large part of China. This caused 70,000 square miles to flood and kill almost 1 million Chinese people. As Chinese troops retreated, anything useful to the approaching Japanese armies was destroyed. This included food supplies, equipment, and so forth, leading to millions more dying of starvation. These actions and others by their own government destroyed any popularity the regime may have formerly held. The alliance between the communists and the nationalists was under great stress by 1939. Historians have noted that communists often executed nationalist guerrilla fighters who also fought in Japanese occupied territory. On several occasions, there were small battles between communist and nationalist army units. The official end of cooperation against Japan was in 1941, when the Communist Party's new Fourth Army was essentially destroyed by a much greater force led by the nationalists. This only helped the Communist Party in portraying Chiang and his forces as being more interested in fighting their own people, the Chinese, than Japan. Chiang's responses to Japan's invasion may have been occasionally successful or at least prevented outright defeat, but they also meant that his government was discredited. CCP guerrillas operating in the countryside worked to educate peasants about their form of communism, the corruption of the capitalist nationalists, and their plans for post-war China, while following a strict code of conduct that treated peasants respectfully. One of the key problems for Japan was how to end this war in favorable terms. The very fact that they were fighting as an occupied force was a number one problem right away. They tried a number of strategies. They wanted to compromise peace terms, but who are you going to negotiate by this period? Chiang Kai-shek or, Chairman Mao of the Communist Party. They also tried a decisive military victory, but all the Chinese military had to do was move further inward in China. And then they also tried setting up an alternative Chinese regime that would agree to terms. But none of these strategies will work, and Japan becomes bogged down in a war they just can't possibly ever win. In conclusion, Japan's army was the main protagonist in the Second Sino Japanese War. Although Japan had not completed its victory against China, ultranationalists in Japan's government and military wanted to further increase the size of the empire at the expense of recently defeated European states. This would help Japan in China as it sought ways to cut all supplies to Chongqing, the base of Chiang and his national forces. These actions eventually provoked the USA to respond, leading directly to the outbreak of the Second World War in Asia and the Pacific Ocean.